Hello, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you to the Family Institute's webinar on how to give an effective apology. If ever there was a more important topic. The Family Institute at Northwestern University is an internationally recognized home to clinically focused researchers, graduate education programs in marriage and family therapy and counseling, and for more than 50 years, your local, reliable resource for behavioral health care services for children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families from all walks of life. My name is Nancy Burgoyne. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer here. I'm also a faculty member in the Marriage and Family Therapy program and a practicing clinician now for more than 30 years. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to my friend and close colleague, Jayne Kinsman, who is so well regarded here at the Family Institute. She's been with us in one role or another for more than 20 years. We're proud to call her an alum of our MFT program. She was the director for many years of our Betty D. Harris Free Clinic. She is the current director of our couple therapy program. And this is a topic near and dear to her heart, which she has committed a great deal of time thinking about and is ready to talk with you about today. Before we get started and I turn it over to Jayne, we did have the pleasure of getting many of your questions in advance. And what we did was wove them to the best of our ability into our content today. So we'll get to as many of those as possible. So Jayne, with that, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nancy, and it's such a pleasure to be here today working with you on this topic and this webinar. So thank you, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. So today I'm going to cover some essential components of an effective apology, and I'll be discussing the very present emotion defensiveness, which I think is the enemy to an effective apology. And I'll be presenting some content. So in terms of the flow of this talk, I'll be presenting content, and then we're going to pivot into answering those questions that Nancy mentioned. And then I'll go back into some content. And if we have time, we'll do more conversation after that. And so what I really wanted in the end is to go over some specific tools. I'm hoping today that the audience members will be able to walk away feeling like you have something tangible to take with you and practice on your own. So before we put the slides up, I wanted to focus. The topic of this discussion is giving effective apology. So I wanted to talk about that word effective for a second. So I chose that word for a very specific reason, because it means producing the desired effect. So in an apology, we're looking for some kind of repair. We're looking for healing and recovered trust, hopefully, or the beginning of that. And there's many ineffective things that we all do when we're having a hard time apologizing. And so today I want to think about that in these terms. What's effective in an apology and what is not? And so, okay, so let's put the slides up. So here's our intro slide, just introducing me and Nancy. And then I'm going to start with some quotes from some of the experts in this field of apology. People who have researched, written books on this topic. And the first quote is by Marjorie Engel and Susan McCarthy in their book, Getting to Sorry. So that quote is, "It's human nature to sometimes disappoint or betray others, but saying you're sorry and doing it well has a near miraculous, superheroic power to heal. Unless they're done very badly, in which case they're hideously ugly, catastrophic, messy things." And that it's kind of like a punchline, because it's this contrast highlights what's at stake. When an apology goes well, it's super powerful, and when it doesn't, it's pretty terrible. So the next slide is a quote from John Cater. So John Cater wrote the book Effective Apology, and he calls himself a business author. So he writes about apologizing in the workplace. So if we actually received quite a number of questions about apologizing specifically in the workplace. So if there's something we don't get to in this talk around that particular topic, I recommend this book, Effective Apology, but also Getting to Sorry. The authors write about the art of apology at work and at home. So John Cater's quote is, "We apologize when we accept responsibility for an offense or a grievance and express remorse in a direct, personal, and unambiguous manner, offering restitution and promising not to do it again." So not all situations are this cut and dry, but there are some really essential pieces here, I think, as we begin to talk about what's included in an effective apology. So he talks about accepting responsibility, expressing remorse, basically showing that you know what happened is a problem, being direct, unambiguous, offering restitution if that's possible. What can you do to make that person whole again? And then a commitment to change. He also talks about the willingness to apologize is the willingness to value the relationship more than the need to be right. And that's a struggle. That's sometimes very hard because being right can feel super important. And I think we all struggle with that, those two things in conversation with people at times, the need to be right versus the value of this relationship. So the next quote is from Harriet Lerner. Harriet Lerner is well known actually for her older book called The Dance of Anger. And she wrote an excellent topic on the topic of apology. It's called Why Won't You Apologize? Healing Big Betrayals and Everyday Trusts, or Everyday Hurts, sorry. And so she talks about non-defensive listening, which is at the heart of offering a sincere apology. And that is an essential piece. So in order to know what you are apologizing for, you have to start by listening. You have to find out from the other person's perspective what happened so that you know what went wrong from their perspective and what you need to apologize for. So the next slide, I'll be talking about just getting the gauge of the scale here. Sometimes saying I'm sorry with nothing else, just I'm sorry, is good enough. And there's different levels. There's different levels of harm and different levels of difficulty in giving an apology. So I want to highlight that. So on one level, just those words indicates that you did something wrong. It shows that you're taking ownership, you're recognizing the harm that happened there. And likely, if that's needed, there's really not a lot of context for the problem. There's not any repetition. So if someone said something rude, they aren't doing that on a regular basis. If they were, I'm sorry, it doesn't have much meaning if the person is repeating that problem over and over again. And the same action or words, in that other way is it takes more time and there's different levels and that we're all capable right now before we even complete this day thinking about effective apologies. We're all capable of providing effective apologies. And I'm certain that everybody in the audience has at some point given an effective apology. And so I hope that the takeaway from this presentation, you'll start to think of yourself as the one who's apologizing and think about how it's hard for you to apologize sometimes and what gets in the way. And the benefit to doing it that way in your brain today is that you'll hopefully get better at apologizing, but also maybe you'll have some compassion and some understanding when you're in a position to receive an apology. So thinking about it from that other person's perspective. Yeah, it's hard to apologize. It takes a lot of thought. Okay, so one of the things, let's go to the next slide. One of the things that I think universally makes it difficult to apologize is defensiveness. And I think of defensiveness as an emotion. It's an emotion that arises, it ebbs and flows away at some point, and it arises when we're feeling misunderstood or when we feel we're being seen as having bad intent. And something that can be helpful when we feel defensive is to remember that two things can be true at the same time. So you can be a good person and have good intent, and you also have caused harm. Those two things can be true. And another thing to keep in mind is the distinction between intent and impact. And so remembering that what you intended to do or what you thought was going to happen or what you saw happening maybe is not what happened. That might not be what the other person sees. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is such a key point, Jayne. I don't think, you mentioned this in the beginning. I don't think we can mention it often enough. this feeling of defensiveness and the reactivity that comes with that, right? The sense of, oh my gosh,
Yes.
what if I did something wrong? And the shame that that can drop us into. And, once we're reactive like that, how the interaction's going to go downhill in a hurry. We got a question related to this. How can you learn to apologize for the way your actions made someone feel, rather than focusing on and feeling that your apology is an admission for having done something wrong, right? The sense of, I don't want to
Yes.
admit I've done something wrong. That's something to think about.
Yes.
But yet, like your intent and impact, the impact is that someone's feelings have been hurt.
Yes, exactly. And maybe we could take the slides down just for a moment so we can have this moment of discussion. We'll put the slides back up when we have more content.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is a hard one. This is where, yes, defensiveness, I think, comes into play here when we are worried about admitting we've done something wrong. I mean, maybe we actually do need to admit that we've done something wrong. And so this idea of intent and impact, talk about a very kind of a basic and simple example, and then I'll expand it into maybe something more complicated. So for example, let's say that you're talking to your friend and you see a piece of grass flew in their hair and you want to get it out. And so you reach up and you go to reach for the thing in their hair. And instead of making contact with their hair, you poke them in the eye and you cause this harm to their eye. Whatever happens, they're like hurt, visibly hurt. And you're appalled that happened. You didn't mean to do that. And so you say, I'm so sorry. Are you okay? And you make sure they're okay and attend to that. And at some point want to explain what happened, and that you didn't intend for that to happen. And their eye is still hurting. And even though you that wasn't your plan, that was the impact. And so people listening to this are probably thinking, okay, well, that's I can see that, but what happens if the person doesn't understand me? And what I've done, it's not actually poking someone in the eye. It's like they think I did, but I actually didn't poke them in the eye. I did this other thing. It's, it's a metaphor to poke somebody in the eye, emotionally speaking. So let's make this a more real life example. So let's say that two people are in a relationship and one says to the other, when you are looking at your phone all the time, we're sitting here together, I wish we were talking, but you look at your phone, or you'll look at your phone in the middle of a conversation. That makes me feel like an afterthought or maybe unimportant to you. And I actually wonder if you're even interested in me at all sometimes. And so that person who receives that feedback could say, are you kidding me? Do you know how much I work? Do you know how much I have to think about what's on my mind every day? Don't you see me? I'm on my phone. I have to do work emails. You have no respect for what I do. And so they can counterattack. And the stance is, you don't understand me. So if you understood that I was so busy with work, you would not feel hurt. You wouldn't feel offended by me looking at the phone if you could just understand my intention. And so both of those two things are true, that the person is feeling unimportant and the other person is busy working. The other way to respond to that, if you receive the comment, hey, looking at your phone hurts my feelings, makes you feel unimportant, you could say, I get how that would be the case for you. I understand how me looking at my phone, you don't know what I'm doing, how that would make you feel unimportant. And I'm really sorry that my actions made you feel that way. You are important to me. So that's the alternative response.
Well, and it's how often the case, right? That if you got me, this wouldn't make you feel that way.
Yes.
Whereas as therapists, I don't think we say anything much more often than both things can be true at the same time.
Yes.
You can feel hurt, and I can also be having an experience over here. And when we try to pile those on in the same conversation, we're not going to position ourselves to give an effective apology. If we have to throw in our piece, part of an effective apology is stepping back and recognizing the other person in that moment for the impact, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes. And empathizing that.
Yeah.
Just open-heartedly empathizing for the impact.
Yeah. We got another question that you and I chatted about before that I want to bring forward because I think it's so important. As a woman, I do my best to not apologize for small things. I'd previously used it unconsciously to smooth out awkward silences. I think people can relate to that. My question is, how, as a woman in a corporate environment, do I apologize at the right moment but not lose respect? And this
Yeah.
could translate to a lot of environments, right? Where apology is meant to be a meaningful thing. And when we use it in another way, then perhaps the meaning is lost.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, sometimes we apologize for being in a space in a way.
Yes.
And so I love this question because it brings up so many different layers. It brings up gender, it brings up the workplace. In my response here, I want to add a layer of talking about race. There's so many layers, but there's so many. So I'll just kind of think about those two things. So, or those three things. So in a workplace, let me say that like in a workplace, I want to demonstrate to my colleagues and my supervisors, my superiors, that I have integrity, that I'm trustworthy and confident and reliable, and that I'm open to feedback. And so if I apologize for something that I've done wrong, then I can communicate that I am those things. An apology can have that effect. And then on the other hand, I don't want to demonstrate that I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't want to demonstrate that I'm uncertain and insecure about my ability to do a job well. And in that case, maybe apologizing or over apologizing or apologizing too quickly could relay that message. It might send the wrong message, one that you wouldn't want to send. So maybe practical advice is that if something goes wrong and a problem is brought to your attention, and maybe even you're being accused of something, a good first step is to be curious and investigate what caused the problem as opposed to immediately apologizing. And so you want to empathize with anyone who had to deal with that issue or the inconvenience. And so that sounds like, oh, wow, that's not good. Or, ooh, that sounds like a problem. Tell me more about how that happened. And you want to understand kind of the chain of events and pull that out. And if there is a part where you are responsible for something that's gone wrong, then apologizing for that specifically demonstrates integrity and transparency. And then your ability to apologize when you make a mistake, which then gives you the chance to talk about how you'll do it differently next time. And so it's tricky, especially if it's high emotion, if there's a lot of emotion involved. And so this question also includes a component of gender. And so the book Getting to Sorry that I referenced a little bit ago, Marjorie Engel and Susan McCarthy have a great chapter in this book on this topic. The chapter is called Girl, Stop Apologizing, or maybe don't. Oh, it's complicated. Gender, race, and power. So the stereotype is women apologize too much. So you throw an anvil on her, she apologizes to the anvil. This is what the quote from the book. So it is true, actually, in terms of the data, that women do apologize more than men do. And there's tons of social science research that demonstrates that's true. And so in this chapter, they go a little bit further than that fact. They talk about, they wonder, what would happen if a woman does not apologize? Why do women apologize more than men? And there's some research that talks about this. So one that I think is really interesting, it comes from 2 studies out of the University of Waterloo. And that study found that men apologize less frequently because they don't feel their actions rise to the level of needing an apology. And so there's that difference. It's kind of like looking at what causes an offense, and maybe conversely, women might expect an apology more frequently than men would expect to receive an apology. So it goes both ways like that. And so the study found that when men and women both feel that they truly have done something wrong and that it warrants apology, 81% of the time, 81% of men and women apologize when they feel they've done something wrong. And also they apologize with equal intensity. And another fact that I think is interesting coming from this research is that women tend to be far less likely to be forgiven for their offenses. So in this chapter, the authors talk about the tightrope that women kind of have to walk in terms of being someone to trust, maybe an authority in a workplace, but also kind and warm and caregiving. And it actually kind of reminded me of the America Ferrera's monologue in the Barbie
Right.
movie, if you've
Yeah.
ever seen that.
Yeah, the tightrope.
Yeah, that's a great monologue. If you haven't seen the movie, you could just YouTube the monologue itself. So adding race to this conversation too, I want to read a quote. This is getting to again, back to this chapter that I was referencing. So this quote from this chapter talks about Black women and apology.
Mhm.
When Black women are perceived as too assertive, white people get anxious, and that frequently is dangerous.
Mm.
Being sorry is literally a lesson in our DNA, writes activist and poet Sonia Renee Taylor. In The Body is Not an Apology, The Power of Radical Self-Love. In the Jim Crow South, an apology could at times be exacted by death, a death sentence. Celeste Wally-Jean, a professor of psychology and dean at Clayton State University in Morrow, Georgia, who studied Black women in anger, found, contrary to popular belief, that rather than exploding when minimally provoked or even unprovoked, as the image of the angry Black woman stereotype summons, African American women in the current sample are less likely to experience angry feelings, even when faced with situations in which they are criticized, disrespected, or evaluated negatively. It doesn't matter, the stereotype remains pernicious.
Mm.
I thought that was really powerful. He talks about the different layers of identity and how we have to consider that when we're thinking about apology in relationship and even in the workplace.
Yeah, these layers of identity, these layers of context. We it would be great to say these are the 5 how-tos,
Yeah.
but there's so many layers of context relationally, in terms of personal identities, in terms of how you're being received, that research sort of, puts that in our faces in a really powerful way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
The other thing that comes up, and in a question, another great question that came in before the webinar was, how do you start an apology to someone when there's joint fault? Right? This was a theme in some of the questions, because we so often in these moments when an apology is asked of us or pulled for, or even when we feel that we owe it to someone, at the same time, there's been an interaction there in all likelihood, where there's a sense, back to your example earlier, of someone looking at their phone and how busy they are and that whole interaction. So getting to this question of how to address it when you're not the only one in the soup.
Yeah, I would say this is often the case. This is often the case when we're talking about relationships. I mean, when we're talking about even like a superficial relationship, like at a restaurant or a barista at the coffee shop, there's 2 sides to what's going on here. And people have a different perspectives of what's due an apology and what's wrong and what's right. So if you would like, what I'm hearing in this question is a desire to start an apology. A desire to start the conversation and to go into healing somehow, to repair something that's gone wrong. And that the struggle there is, but this other person also needs to take ownership. And so if you go into the conversation expecting the other person to take ownership, you're setting your agenda for the conversation. You're also setting their agenda for the conversation. And so if you want to have a true, genuine, effective apology, then I would focus on that as your point. And that you go in, and yes, there's 2 sides to the story. There's another piece of it. We start with a generous heart, and really purely for the sake of this apology, go in to take ownership for your part. So the person may hear it in that moment, may receive it as perfect. Our conversation's done. You've taken entire ownership over this entire problem. Thank you. Nice to talk to you. That might happen, and that's okay. Don't abandon your goal. Stick with that, and just keep with that. Just stick with your apology and say, yeah, I did that, and maybe you might have to, through the course of the conversation, you might have to reference that there's other pieces, but you don't want to focus on that right now. You want to focus on the harm that was done from your actions. And
Yeah,
if you
time is your friend. Time is your
time,
friend
yes,
in
it
this
can,
case. You can separate
yes,
these things in time.
exactly. It's your friend because it makes your point so much more powerful if you reserve that for another conversation.
Mhm.
That if you bring in this other piece, like, hey, you know, you did this, you have some responsibility here. I'd like to hear your part. When you hear me apologizing, I'd like you to take some, you know, follow suit here.
Mhm.
Then you become adversaries and you are in a debate. It become
Mhm.
that will certainly trigger defensiveness, and then it becomes like who's more responsible, and it just won't be the kind of apology, won't be the kind of repair that I'm sensing this person is looking for.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Jayne. That makes a lot of sense. I know you have some tools for us.
Yes. So now we have a bit more slides that will bring that back up and talk about some tools that I'm hoping that you can think about and work on when you leave from this webinar. So in the spirit of a genuine apology, it comes the willingness to sit in the hot seat. I think about
Mhm.
that. Like when you're sitting there and in the stance of like, I want to apologize, you're in the hot seat. You have this takes emotion regulation.
Mhm.
And so the first bullet point here, be ready to have regulated emotions. Make sure you're in a good state of mind, maybe a neutral or possibly a hopeful state of mind. Do not go into that conversation hot. And next, say the words. Have the courage to say, I am sorry. I am sorry that I said blank. I'm sorry that I hurt you. And that's crystal clear, saying it that
Mhm.
way, not adding any other sentences. That's kind of like stop right there. It's not qualified. And it is courageous to do that because it is this experience of being in the hot seat. And demonstrate that you know why what happened was problematic, and
Mhm.
understand that you may at this moment be feeling really strongly, you did this too, is kind of back to the point they were making just a moment ago. It's not the time for that. There's two sides. Get to your piece and you'll be able to deliver an effective apology. So don't try to share ownership in this moment, and use the active voice. So there's so many things we do to avoid the hot seat. You turn down the heat when you
Mhm.
say, I'm
Mhm.
sorry that you were offended. It just takes you out of the light just a little bit. And so
I'm sorry
just
you feel that way.
I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry that sorry you were insulted. And so
Mhm.
you're hiding when you use the passive voice. So come out from behind the covers of that passive voice and say, I am sorry that I insulted you,
Mhm.
as opposed to I'm sorry you were insulted.
Mhm.
A joke is I'm sorry that the toaster was dropped on your foot. That's why I take ownership. Okay, so the
Mhm.
next slide. So the other piece of guidance is only explain if you need to. And certainly don't put your explanation in the first set of things that you're going to say. Like save the explanation if it needs to come up. That's sometimes, I would say, just usually not okay. Um, and then often I'll hear people say, like in a conversation that requires some kind of apology or repair, they'll say, "Can I just tell you why this happened from my perspective?"
Mhm.
And when
Mhm.
I hear that, it's a question. You know, yes, you're asking for permission to bring that into the conversation. But when I hear that, I know that that person is really getting antsy and aching to kind of get off the hot seat and kind of show their good intentions, show that they're a good person. And because of the need to explain, even if it's framed in that question, it's almost always unwelcome, especially in the initial stages of the conversation. And so just save that for later. It'll pack a punch maybe later. Maybe it'll be more powerful for the person to understand when they're ready to hear that. Also, don't ask for forgiveness. So
Mhm.
this point is actually debatable, and some in the this area of expertise would argue in favor of asking for forgiveness. So my
Mhm.
perspective of this is that asking for forgiveness puts pressure on the other person to help you feel better.
Absolutely.
So it's an attempt to put the problem in the resolved file and
Mhm.
just kind of wrap it up. So Engel and McCarthy say apology is mandatory and forgiveness is not. And I think that's really well said. They talk about forgiveness as a gift. And so I like that idea, because if you think about receiving a gift, you're not going to say, can I have the gift? Can I have it? Can I have this thing? Can you give this to me? When you receive it, you're joyfully surprised to receive it. And that's the stance you should take with forgiveness.
Yeah.
And allow the person to come to that on their own.
I love that, Jayne.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. And it can feel like a really well-intended question. Will you please forgive me?
But that gift metaphor is really helpful. That's a gift that's freely given when you ask for it, because I understand in many traditions, you'll ask for forgiveness, and I'm not trying to stand in the up against that, but to think about it this way, I think shifts it.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. So don't make the other person take care of you is another point here on the slide. And this idea, it seems like no one will go into the apology with the intention of making that happen, but it happens through the course of like how the conversation is going. So in extreme situations, it looks like intense dysregulation, threatening to hurt yourself, or actually doing that. In other words, putting yourself through emotional or physical like self-flagellation and being so sorry, and not being able to tolerate the disconnect when you have done something wrong. In less extreme examples, it means that the apologizers may be over apologetic, or just pushing the conversation along to talk about how terrible they feel, and the conversation could lead to the person who was harmed to say, it's okay, don't worry about it, I know you didn't mean it, and that is a false resolution. It closes the conversation down, and it surely gets you off the hot seat, but that's not true repair. And it takes more effort, and it takes more time to kind of sit through that process of listening about what happened. So let me see here, where am I? So next, let's see, I think we're on to the next slide.
Yeah, and if I can put something in here, and maybe this is a good tee up to this slide. One of the questions that came through, a theme that came through some of the questions is, should I apologize to my children? There's a hierarchy there. What does an apology look like to a child who's young, a child who's perhaps an adult? There's culturally, that's a conversation right now, sometimes young adults approaching or adults approaching parents with things that have hurt them. And we have a colleague, Dr. Alan Saby, who's done some research in this department, showing in fact that parents apologizing to their children appropriately without modeling shame, without doing some of those things that Jayne had on the last slide, sort of this overreaction, but sort of apologizing matter-of-factly and lovingly to a child is a great way to repair, to model for them how you want to be, improves the relationship, and doesn't threaten authority. It actually sort of models a form of leadership.
Absolutely.
That's gracious. Yeah. And boy, if ever there's a moment with children being prepared to absorb the pain and hurt that you may hear back, sometimes it's in this dynamic, the parent-child dynamic, where this is the strongest, and parents need the self-regulation skills the most.
Oh my goodness. Yes, this is such an important, there could be a whole webinar on this topic, I think. Let's ask Alan to come and talk about this.
Yes, indeed.
And it's an important one. And there's so many books and resources guiding parents in terms of how to parent, how to think about what you're doing. I agree wholeheartedly with the stance you're taking, Nancy, on that it is a valuable lesson in raising a person with a good heart to show that you're capable of apologizing, to show that you recognize that your child is a human with feelings, and that you're a human capable of mistakes. And that's a beautiful lesson, and it builds trust. And this idea of absorbing the pain and hurt, that is certainly, I would say, the parent's job, to not expect this to be an equal conversation. And we're talking, it's, you mentioned lots of different ages. So I'm just imagining like 0 to 5 is different from 5 to 10, and even parents who with adult children, it's like a different conversation. But the parent-child dynamic is a very special one in terms of apology and repair. And the parent role, no matter how, if your child's an adult, you are still the parent. And
Yes.
there's a certain role that you have with that person. And certainly without context of a story, can't speak too specifically. And there's lots of nuance here. But it is a beautiful lesson overall, and it shows authority. It's not
Mhm.
a usurpation of your power to apologize. And also I want to recall back to the idea of like different scales of difficulty. So, if there's an easy, I'm sure most parents have apologized when, I bump into you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like you
Mhm.
deserve an apology there. I didn't mean to do that. Versus, hey, you have this issue with me, and now we have to have this difficult conversation about something I did that made you feel bad. And likely a child is not going to kind of bring it to you as clearly as that, if they're younger. And so trying to figure out how you can identify what are your values as a parent, what kind of um, parent are you looking to be? And if
Mhm.
you have acted in a way that makes you feel out of line with your values as a parent,
Mhm.
that might be an indication that a conversation or to revisit what happened is in order.
Yeah.
And recognizing and naming kind of, these are my values and this is what I want to be able to do in that situation, and I didn't do it.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, and in that context, in any this being prepared to absorb the pain.
Yes.
Sometimes we think we're feeling a little bit virtuous if we're going to deliver an apology, and sometimes are unprepared for the scale of the hurt. We may have an idea of what the proportion is,
Yes.
but you're really warning folks to just prepare yourself to absorb and contain it, and not judge the scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, this is a good rule of thumb. When you're delivering an apology, it's the start of the conversation.
Yes.
And a lot of times we can, when there's a lot, especially when there's a lot of pain, it feels like, okay, let's move on from here. We've had this conversation twice now. I get it. I said I was sorry. I don't know what else you want from me. What am I
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do? I already said, I mean, and so the feeling is, if you need me to repeat this again, either you weren't listening
Mm-hmm.
or my words don't mean anything to you. Maybe you don't believe me. And so it starts
Mm-hmm.
to get like, you get activated for that reason. And so you have to keep in mind that it is normal. This is a very normal process, the repetition
Yes.
and the pain and the onslaught, kind of the opening up. The apology opens up, because it's saying, hey, I understand you're hurt. And the person says, yeah, can I please tell you about that? Can I tell you about what
Mm-hmm.
happened? And then, so you're saying, I'm sorry, is saying, yes, please tell me about that. I want to hear. I'm not going to judge. You're at a 10 out of 10. I personally think you probably should be at a 5, but
Mm-hmm.
you can't judge that. It's about their experience. And the other piece here that I want to mention is that receiving that can be flooding, that you
Yes.
might feel caught off guard. Maybe you said, I'm sorry for something that you thought was probably due, but then the person opens up about something you didn't even realize how deep it was. And that might be flooding to you. And so take ownership over your own emotions. Remember, emotion regulation is a key
Number
piece in
one.
starting an apology.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, you have to
Mm-hmm.
start with a regulated body. And you might become dysregulated through the course of the conversation. And so take ownership. It's okay to stop in the middle and say, this is, speaking about your experience. You're not saying you are overwhelming me. You're saying, I need a break. This is a lot right now, and I really want to hear what you have to say, but right now I'm not able to process it. I need to take, I need to come back to this. And you
Mm-hmm.
could come back to it a day later. You could come back to it 2 hours later. The idea is, though, that if you're taking a break, you need to come back to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so you want to finally, the last bullet point here is to focus on making the other person feel heard. And so
Yeah.
this is a bit of an intro into the next slide. So focusing on making the other person feel heard, there's this tool that's very effective, very helpful, And I teach people in therapy how to do this, especially if there's more than one person in the room, how to do this for each other. It's called reflective listening. It's also known as active listening. So the goal is to listen in order to understand versus listening for your turn to say something. And the act is you reflect back what the other person is saying to you. You ask at the end, do I have that right? So you're saying, okay, so are you saying that when I'm on my phone, you're feeling unimportant and it makes you feel sad? Is that what you're saying? Yes, that's, you're looking for the person to say, yeah, exactly. And sometimes what I see is someone will say, oh, so basically you're saying I am a lazy bum and I'm just playing games on my phone all day. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Which
And
makes it
that's,
about you.
yeah, it makes it about you and you're being defensive and you're predicting what that person is saying to you. You want to really find out. There's that the Harriet Lerner quote that open-hearted, non-defensive listening is at the key, at the heart of genuine apology. And so this metaphor is super helpful to me, I think. I hope it's helpful to listeners that if you consider that you're playing catch with two different balls. So we've got a baseball and we've got a football. And so let's say Nancy and I are trying to have a conversation and I want to bring to her, hey, she's on her phone, when we're talking, I can tell she's distracted and I want to say, hey, it feels like you've got a lot of other things going on. I'm starting to feel not important. That's my baseball. And Nancy has this feedback like, hey, I got a lot of stuff going on. If you were to consider this as a work versus personal, but I kind of moved the context. But let's say Nancy has to say, I have a lot of things that I need to say to you. I'm distracted, but it's something going on between us. I want to raise it to you. I can't throw the baseball and Nancy throw the football and expect that we're both going to catch that.
Gotcha.
And so one of us has to go first. And so the first person to go, let's say it's the baseball, I'm going to say, hey, Nancy, can you catch this? So in order to do that, Nancy has to put down the football. Yeah. She's going to say, all right, I've got this thing I have to say. This is back to the idea that maybe it's for another time. And so you put it down and, okay, I'm ready. My hands are free. I'm not thinking about my thing right now. I'm going to be ready to catch what you're talking about. And so the baseball comes and Nancy says, okay, so this is what you're saying. Do I have that right? And the metaphor is a baseball. So it's like, okay, it's got some stitches. It's white. It's well worn. And then do I have that right? And then Nancy throws it back to me. And so there's a back and forth. And so I say, yes, that is right. And I also wanted you to pay attention to this particular piece here, that this is what it was. And there's this bullet point here, slow down and make it small bite-sized bits. So if I said, if I described an entire story, the person listening to me is not going to be able to remember. Usually after 2 to 3 sentences, it's hard to track. And so break it down into 2 to 3 sentences at a time and go back and forth with the baseball until the point's made. And then there might be time or maybe not. I would suggest, bring the football up later. That's my first suggestion. But if for whatever reason it has to happen and both of you are ready for that piece of it, then it's time. The person who had the baseball has to be ready to catch the football and is prepared to listen and be open to that.
I love this. Put your football down and don't throw an inning's worth of baseballs in one fell swoop. That's one ball, one strike at a time.
Yes.
Ball, one swipe at a time.
Yes.
It's brilliant.
So, okay. So I think we're ready. Oh, there we go. Oh, for the next slide.
Yeah, let's move.
So I mentioned, I mentioned a moment ago that apology is the start of the conversation and that the apologizer needs to be prepared to hear more about the injury or the problem and that you're going to receive a lot. And so when the conversation repeats for the apologizer, it can feel like, what's going on here? I'm very confused. And so just to keep in mind that be prepared. It's very normal, especially when the severity, so we're thinking about that level, the levels, when it's beyond, I'm sorry, it's up to a higher level. Repetition is very normal. And that's about the person processing their story. It's about finding reassurance.
Yes. And
reestablishing safety.
Yes.
And so the idea is to empathize every single time with the emotions, even if you feel like this is repeat, you're going to say maybe the exact same things you said before. Say it again. Say it as many times as you need to say.
That this really leads right into a question we got many times. And of course, the whopper question is, what's the role of an apology in infidelity? And the notion, I know in your work plenty of times and in mine as well, aren't I done yet? I've been apologizing for a month. I've been apologizing for 6 months. I've been apologizing. How long do I apologize? When you're reestablishing trust and safety, and the world, provides triggers for remembering things over and over again, apologizing over time, multiple times, is normal and necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my areas of expertise, I work a lot with couples who are recovering from an affair.
Yeah.
And I work with individuals too, but in the couple setting, that repetition, the apology is a part of this larger conversation that often takes years to have the entire conversation. And if you can imagine, a world where you wake up and suddenly all the rules of the world, laws of gravity don't apply. You're essentially Alice in Wonderland. And
yes.
Things started, things are unpredictable. And then they went back to normal, or they started to go back to normal, or had the promise of going back to normal. You'd have a hard time kind of just sitting with like, okay, that happened. I'm not going to ask any questions about the world anymore. It takes time to process like why that happened, what happened, what's going on here. And in there, apology happens. And also being sensitive to the person who was betrayed. They may not want an apology yet. They may have more questions. That there's a process. And there's actually a book, Janice Abrams Spring wrote this book called After the Affair. I have a slide of resources. This book is not on that slide of resources, but she wrote this great book, and she actually talks about both sides, the person who had the affair and the person who was betrayed, and she talks about how to think about that. So I recommend looking into that for more information. So next I wanted to talk about some tools for folks who are seeking an apology. So I know I said in the beginning, hey, think about yourself as the one giving the apology, but this is important too, because you want to set the stage and not to put onus on the person who's experienced some kind of harm, but there are ways to present your feelings, and I want to name some of those. So effective ways, I should say, to present your feelings. So there's this idea of an I message versus a you message. So the I message, so the I message means I'm speaking from my experience and my emotions, and I'm avoiding assuming what the other person's intentions are. So instead of saying, I add this bullet point, which this happens. I feel you are selfish is actually a you message. So you want to, the goal is to talk.
But it's my feeling.
It's my feeling that you are selfish. That's kind of that's a cheat. That's a iMessage cheat. So the thing you're looking for in an iMessage is to talk about your emotion. And so what is the emotion in this case? If a person feels someone else is being selfish, maybe the feeling is unimportant. Maybe I'm feeling small. Maybe I'm feeling forgotten. I'm feeling like I'm reminded of some other experience in my life that's hard, and I want to talk about that. So you can tell there's a difference between those two statements. One is pretty a strong stance, and it's pretty self-assertive. The other is vulnerable, and it's a little harder. So you're putting yourself out there. So an appropriate or a well-used I statement is a little hard. It's because you're putting your heart out there and you're explaining your emotional experience. And the goal is you're looking for the person to empathize. Right. So you're wanting to trigger empathy as opposed to defensiveness. So the next tool on the next slide comes from the Gottman Institute, which they do a lot of, John Gottman and his team does a lot of research on couples and effective ways that couples can communicate. And so I love this concept of the soft startup. So some of the essentials of a soft startup are describing the facts without judgment, addressing the issue at hand as opposed to storing things up and you've got your kind of pile of bricks, not attacking or blaming. The other thing I tell couples is thinking about this in terms of a scale of 1 to 10. If you start at an 8, any conflict really, wherever you start, it's probably going to escalate a little bit from there. So if you start
Yeah.
an eight, you don't have a lot of room. And so if you try to start at a 3, you have a little bit of wiggle room to have a little more tension happen. But that's an effective way to start a conversation that's difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, so next slide. So finally, just wanted to put a plug. Hey, we're therapists here. Of course, we're going to talk about therapy. So if the difficulty continues and you might use some support, maybe therapy is something you should consider. And keeping in mind that individual therapy is not often the best way to resolve relationship distress.
Correct.
So you can have kind of like an echo chamber there, and you can't report what the other person's perspective is because it's your perspective of their perspective. And so consider couples therapy when you're having a relational issue. And the therapist can help provide tools, these and others, that you can practice in the session and outside of the session. And even, some people think, oh, therapy, that's like a lifelong thing, right? No, you can actually have a few sessions that might help you facilitate the conversation you're looking to have. And so you could kind of go in and out if you're feeling like you don't want to do that, or potentially finances don't allow. Okay, so last slide. Yeah, I think not really the last slide, but the last kind of piece of my content. I wanted to read this quote. So this quote, let me find my information on this quote. So this quote, I love it. So it's coming from a book, which is called Seeds Planted in Concrete. So that book it's a collection of poems and prose by Bianca Sparacino. And I'm including this because it brings us to I'm going to read it in a second. So those of you who are looking at this, don't read it yet. I can just read it in a moment. It takes us to the 10,000-foot view of our life and what perspective we want to take. We ask ourselves, how do I want to live my life, and how do I want to act towards those I love and care about? And so when defensiveness arises, when you're having a hard time apologizing, you only see the nose on your face. You're only looking at the emotions in the moment, and those emotions are what are informing what you're saying in that moment. So I hope you listen to this quote and take that to heart as a recommendation for what to do when you want to offer a genuine apology. Maybe in another lifetime. No, this is all you get. So please fight for the things that crack light into your life. Fight for the things that soften you. Protect the people you love. Leave them better than you found them. Defend your heart. Do whatever it takes to keep it open, despite what it has been through. Forgive not just others, but yourself as well. Slow down. Taste and touch and feel and care. Create the things you want to see in this world. Stay as curious as possible. Honor your joy. Do not shy away from the good that is trying to reach you. Do not convince yourself that you are unworthy of it. Be strong enough to be gentle. Be brave enough to break. Be all that you are. Be all that you are.
And I so honor this, and it's so you, and it's such a great, profound message. We want the 3 how-tos, and
Yes.
things are so complex contextually and so complex internally that really what you're trying to set us up for here with these beautiful words and your talk is getting yourself in a space where you can soften, access your vulnerability, stay regulated. That's the setup to any effective apology. It's not the exact words. It's the space that you occupy as a person as you move into wanting to offer that to someone.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautiful. That's really, really beautiful.
Yeah, it's very moving.
It's very moving.
The next slide is my resources slide.
Yeah,
so to provide
great.
that just as a glance of the books that I use to inform my talk today, and some that I think are a little extra. So there you go.
Thank you, Jayne. Well, and less poetic, but hopefully as useful, we want to remind you that we are a resource here for you. The kinds of conversations that this raises and the kinds of challenges it raises, sometimes any one of us would need some support with. So we want to remind you that we're here for you. We do now have scheduling online if you want, and that this talk will be posted online. You can advance the slide, Tori, please. If you look on our website under library resources and multimedia, we post all of these webinars that we create and other resources there for you to take in times that are convenient for you. And if you want to view this again, this will be posted in a day or two there for you to look at. So I want to thank you, Jayne.
My pleasure.
Of course, we could talk about this quite a bit
Yes.
longer, and I'm gonna avoid getting into any last questions because I think you covered a lot of material.
Yeah.
Any last words of wisdom before we wrap up today?
I said all of it. No.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you, Nancy, for being here. It was just a joy to prepare this webinar with you and just be in this space with you. So thank you. And also thank you to all of those who have attended here live today and who are listening later. I hope that this webinar and this information that we've shared has triggered some thoughts and maybe motivated some change for you.
Great. Thank you all very much.